The 20th century was certainly a time of great shift in the world at large, a time where countries and their ideologies, systems of government, and forms of economics all had to adapt to the new domination of a system that prevailed through the Industrial Revolution, an event comparable to the Agricultural Revolution in terms of impact on mankind. This system was the economic idea of capitalism, a system that crumbled the last feudal system strongholds of the world and gave rise to a world economy based on the individual and their ability to soar higher for themselves. But as contempt for this system grew due to the harsh conditions and in the eyes of the exploited, its reflections of greed and inhuman action, a new form of system rose up to eventually rival capitalism in a stalemate that eventually threatened the existence of all of mankind itself. This economic and political system is socialism. But before we dive into what socialism really is, we need to go over a few key vocabulary terms that will help us better understand the idea of socialism. The first vocab term we'll be looking at is the means of production, which is the tools and stuff needed to make things, like factories, machines, raw materials, and land. In other words, it's everything that helps create goods and services. The next vocab term we'll be looking at is class struggle. This is a term from Karl Marx and refers to the conflict between social classes, especially between the rich and the poor. Another term by Marx is the bourgeoisie, and this is the term that Marx gave to the owners and capitalists, the people who own factories, businesses, or land. They are the wealthy class that under capitalism usually hold the most power. The next term by Marx we'll be looking at is the proletariat, who are people who sell their labor for wages, like factory workers or office workers. In socialist theory, like we presented before with the idea of the class struggle, the proletariat is often contrasted with the bourgeoisie. As a refresher from our previous video, capitalism is an economic system where property and businesses are owned by private individuals or companies, and prices or output are mostly decided by free market forces such as supply and demand. The next term we'll be looking at is collective ownership, which is the idea that key resources and industries are owned by the community as a whole, and often through the state, and not by individuals or companies. The final vocab word we'll be looking at is social benefits. These are things like free or low-cost public services, like healthcare, education, or welfare programs. So, now that we've gone over our key vocabulary, it's finally time to get into the meat of the video. What exactly is socialism? Broadly speaking, socialism is an economic and political system where society, often through the government, owns and controls major industries and wealth with the goal of equity, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Instead of a small handful of individuals being in control of the means of production, the means might be run by the state, by cooperatives of workers, or even by the community as a whole. The basic idea is that everyone collectively owns important resources, like farms, factories, banks, or utilities. Then the wealth can be shared by all, rather than concentrating in the hands of a few rich capitalists. Socialism holds that common or public ownership of resources and means of production will lead to a more equal society. In other words, socialists argue that if we all have a stake in those resources, then everyone benefits, not just the wealthy. Socialism is often a contrast with capitalism. Socialists point out that in capitalism, the owners or the bourgeoisie can accumulate a lot of wealth and power by controlling businesses, while ordinary workers, the proletariat, are just working for wages and have no real ability to secure their own productive assets. Socialists argue that this can create big gaps between the rich and the poor. In a socialist view, shifting ownership to the public can reduce those gaps and give ordinary people more freedom and security. Now that we've gotten a clear definition of what socialism is, we're now going to look at a few key principles of socialism that we can define to every form of its practice. The first of these key principles is the collective or public ownership of the means of production. In socialism, major industries and resources are owned by the community as a whole, and this can mean state ownership, worker cooperatives, or other forms of social ownership. The goal is to prevent a handful of private owners from controlling all the factories and natural resources. Instead, society makes sure these assets serve everyone's needs. The second principle we'll be looking at is economic equality and wealth redistribution. Socialists aim to reduce the gaps between the rich and the poor, and they support heavy taxation on the wealthy, social programs, or direct provision of services like public healthcare education so that even people without much money can have a decent life. The third principle is economic planning. Rather than leaving all decisions to market forces, many socialists favor planning how the economy works. This could mean the government setting production goals, deciding which goods to make and how much, or coordinating resources in a central plan. The aim is to meet people's needs systematically instead of market swings. The fourth principle is labor and workers' rights. Socialism historically stresses strong labor rights, decent wages, safe working conditions, limits on hours, and the right to unionize. Early socialists pointed out how factory workers suffered during the Industrial Revolution and demanded laws to protect them. The next principle we'll be looking at is class consciousness and social welfare. Many socialists believe in raising awareness of class differences so that workers see themselves as a group with common interests. They also promote social safety nets, unemployment benefits, pensions, disability support, and so on. The idea is that no one should fall into destitution just because of bad luck, since everyone deserves a decent standard of living. The final key principle is democratic or participatory control. Democratic socialism, for example, insists that both society and its economy be run democratically, not by dictatorship. This could mean workers voting on workplace decisions, communities having a say, or freely elected governments directing resources for the public good. Even in socialist systems where the state is strong, ideally it's supposed to represent the people, not impose decisions by force. Just like capitalism, though, socialism also takes many different forms, and we'll be looking at a couple here. The first of which is utopian socialism. Utopian socialism is the earliest form of socialist thinking and promotes the idea that society could be improved through cooperation, shared ownership, and planned communities, rather than competition and private property. It imagines perfect or ideal societies where everyone works together and shares resources fairly, hence the word utopian. The next form of socialism is Marxism. The idea of Marxism emerged in the mid-1800s, with Karl Marx along with Friedrich Engels developing a detailed theory of socialism in their own terms. This argued that capitalism contains the seeds of its own downfall, that over time the proletariat would rise up, seize the state, and create a classless, stateless society. This ultimate goal is communism, a system based on common ownership of the means of production, where property and goods are commonly owned by society, and each person contributes what they can while receiving what they need. In practice, the first major example was the Soviet Union after the 1917 Russian Revolution. The next form of socialism is democratic socialism. Democratic socialists believe the economy should serve the needs of all people, but they insist on achieving this through democratic means, elections, votes, and civil rights, rather than by dictatorship. They often work within existing governments. For example, many countries like Sweden, Norway, or France have strong welfare policies and government involvement in the economy, yet remain democracies. There continue to be many other forms of socialism beyond these few, such as anarcho-socialists or syndicalists who want to eliminate the state entirely. Now that we've gone over what socialism is, some of the vocab it contains, and gone over the different forms it can take, we are now going to take a broader look at the history of socialism from its beginning to its place in society today. Since the idea of sharing goods communally has existed for so long, to first look at the history of socialism, we must go back to the ancient and medieval roots of the practice. For example, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato described a form of communal life for the guardians of his ideal city in his book The Republic, who envisioned a society ruled by philosopher kings, and these guardians, who would serve as rulers, were to live a communal life, without private property or conventional families, to ensure they were free from personal interests and could focus on the common good. When looking at the ideas of socialism in medieval history, in 1516, Thomas More wrote the book Utopia about an island where all goods were shared, and envisioned his idea of a perfect European society. As we can see, proto-socialist ideas have existed far before the emergence of socialism that we see commonly attributed to the rise of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. But now, to get a better look at the history of modern socialist ideology, we have to look at the Industrial Revolution and early socialists of the late 1700s and early 1800s. The modern socialist movement really took off in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. As factories popped up in Europe around 1800, working conditions became extremely harsh. Children and adults worked 12 to 16 hours a day for tiny pay, often in dangerous jobs. Rich factory owners got very rich, but workers stayed poor. Thinkers and reformers, later called utopian socialists, reacted against this. They argued that private ownership of factories was the root of injustice. For example, Robert Owen, a successful mill owner in Scotland, believed that giving workers education, better housing, and reasonable hours would prove it was more efficient and moral to cooperate. In 1817, he proposed the idea of an 8-hour work. Others, like Charles Fourier and Henri de Saint-Simon, dreamed up ideal cooperative cities. They didn't overthrow governments, but inspired working class movements by showing a kinder alternative to capitalism. Moving into the mid 19th century, we now explore the idea of Marx and Engels in the context of socialism. 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto, laying out a new theory of socialism, often called communism. They described history as a class struggle between oppressors and oppressed, and they argued that capitalism, despite creating wealth, would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. Marx predicted that the proletariats would seize power and create a classless society. While Marx wrote extensively, he expected the transition, the dictatorship of the proletariat, to eventually lead to a stateless socialist society. Marx's ideas inspired working class movements and unions across Europe. By the late 1800s, socialist parties were forming in many countries, such as Germany, France, and Britain. Some were revolutionary, like Russia's Bolsheviks. Others were reformists, like the German Social Democrats who focused on elections. As Marx's work spread throughout the world, so too did his ideas come to fruition in the early 20th century through the revolutions and world wars. The first major socialist revolution happened in Russia in 1917. Led by Lenin, the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government and started a communist regime. Lenin's party later created the Soviet Union in 1922, which aimed to build up socialism. Other revolutions followed. China's revolution in 1949 established the People's Republic of China under Mao, and a wave of communist governments emerged in Eastern Europe after World War II, supported by the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, many socialist and social democrat parties took part in democratic politics. For example, in Britain after World War II, the Labour Party won power in 1945 and nationalized key industries and established the National Health Service. France, Sweden, Norway, and other countries also elected socialist or social democratic governments that expanded welfare and workers' rights. During this time, there was a split. You had communists who aligned with Moscow and often favored one-party rule, who clashed with the socialists or social democrats who wanted democratic reforms. Moving on to the late 20th century, we can better examine socialism and its place in the Cold War and beyond. From 1945 to 1989, the world saw the Cold War, capitalist Western Bloc versus communist Eastern Bloc. This period saw socialist states, such as the Soviet Union, China after Mao, and Cuba after 1959, competing with capitalist countries. Meanwhile, Western European socialism became more moderate. For example, the German Social Democrats removed overt Marxist goals from their platform by 1959, focusing on welfare state policies. A big turning point was 1989 to 1991, which saw the collapse of Soviet communism. Eastern European communist governments fell, such as Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, and the USSR itself dissolved. Many of these countries then shifted towards capitalism or mixed economies. China, meanwhile, had already opened markets, and today has a mostly market economy with a communist party in charge. By the early 21st century, only a few countries, like China, Cuba, and North Korea, officially call themselves communists, and even they have mixed elements. Now, looking at the history of socialism today, we can see that strict socialist economies are rare. However, many countries keep social welfare programs inspired by socialism. For example, much of Europe still has free healthcare, public education, and other social programs that 20th century socialists helped introduce. In America, some governments have elected socialist or leftist leaders in recent decades, such as in Bolivia, Venezuela, and Brazil, attempting various reforms. In the United States, democratic socialism has become a topic of debate, with figures like Bernie Sanders advocating for things like Medicare for all and free college, ideas rooted within socialist thinking. Now that we've gone over the full history of socialism, we can now look at its greatest contributions and criticisms. The contributions of socialism are as follows: labor rights, social safety nets, equality and social reforms, and economic development goals. Socialism, however, has also had many pitfalls, and they are as follows: economic inefficiency, authoritarian outcomes, reduced incentives and innovation, and practical challenges. To conclude this video on socialism, we must understand that socialism is a broad philosophy centered on sharing and cooperation, and born out of a desire to make society fairer. It has introduced powerful ideas, such as the value of public services and workers' rights, that many people around the world accept today. At the same time, real-world attempts at socialism have shown difficulties that are still debated, and no doubt that the authoritarian misrepresentation of socialism has definitely shown how this ideology can be twisted and lead to greater suffering.